The air was heavy that morning, not with rain or storm, but with a silence so unnatural that even the birds refused to sing. The town square stood ready for something no one had ever seen before, and most would never forget. A massive iron cauldron rested above a thick bed of burning wood, its sides blackened from heat, its surface trembling with the rolling boil of water within. Around it gathered the townspeople, not with cheer or celebration, but with a grim curiosity that kept their feet rooted and their mouths shut, the man they were about to watch. Di had been known by many once as Richard Roos, a cook, a man of routine and quiet living who had served food to noblemen and lords. Until one day he was accused of something unspeakable. They said he had poisoned the broth at a noble table. One man had died and others had taken ill, and before anyone could ask too many questions, Richard was dragged away to prison. The court was swift and the judgment came faster. Still guilty, they declared, without mercy, without pause, and then came the most shocking part of all the punishment. King Henry himself demanded a new law, a new way of dealing with poisoners. Boil him alive. The king said, let his screams be the warning, let his flesh in steam be the justice, so the law was written just for him. And now Richard stood on the edge of history, not as a man, but as an example. His hands were tied, his ankles bound, and his face, though pale, betrayed no fear. Only a deep, hollow stillness. The guards who held him looked more afraid than he did, their hands shaking, their eyes flickering toward the bubbling cauldron as if it too could see and breathe and know what was coming. Smoke curled upward into the sky, carrying with it the scent of iron and burning wood. The crowd remained silent. Only the youngest among them whispered, asking why, asking how, asking if this was truly what justice meant. No one answered. The questions hung in the air like ghosts. Then the command was given. The guards began to move Richard forward step by step toward the heat. The fire popped and cracked. The water hissed as if eager to meet him. The ropes were checked again, the pulley tested. The executioner stood ready, a large man with tired eyes and stained hands. The crowd leaned forward, not in hunger for blood, but in disbelief that such a moment could truly be happening. This was no hanging, no sword, no axe. This was fire and water. This was pain turned into law, and as Richard was lifted into the air and swung gently over the mouth of the pot, time itself seemed to freeze. Everyone waited breathless, watching the man who was about to become something else entirely. Something history would never forget. Something neither dead nor alive, only boiling. The ropes creaked as they lowered him slowly into the cauldron. The steam rose to meet him, wrapping around his legs like some ancient ghost welcoming its prey. The crowd gasped as his feet touched the surface of the boiling water, and then it began. The scream that left his mouth was not the scream of an ordinary man. It was the roar of a soul being torn from the body. It pierced through every wall, every chest, every quiet heart. Standing in that square, the sound bounced off the stones, off the church bells, off the very sky. His skin reddened instantly. His legs flinched and shook. His knees buckled as the water consumed him. The guards hesitated, but the order was clear. He must be lowered slowly, inch by inch, so the people would see, so the people would remember. His hands gripped the ropes. His eyes stared upward into nothing. His back arched, and his head jerked as the water climbed past his waist. It boiled through him, not just around him. The pain was not something anyone could imagine. His flesh swelled, then split in places, small bursts of skin, peeling like paper in fire, and still the pulley turned downwards. His chest submerged, his arms trembled, his voice began to change, first into gasps, then into silence. His mouth opened and closed like a drowning man, but there was no water to drink, no breath to take, only steam, only heat, only death that refused to come quickly. The crowd was frozen, not cheering, not weeping, just watching. Locked in place by the horror unfolding before them, mothers clutched their children. Fathers turned away, unable to meet the eyes of the man being cooked alive. Some people dropped to their knees, praying, whispering, trembling, as if judgment itself had stepped into their midst. The executioner looked away at last, unable to stomach what his own hands had helped carry out. Richard Roos, now submerged to his shoulders, was no longer screaming, no longer moving, but he was not yet dead. The water kept boiling louder, now as if angry, as if hungry. The fire beneath raged, licking the sides of the cauldron, roaring with power. The ropes jerked and held him there, half inside, half out. His face, twisted not in anger but in sorrow. His eyes burned, but still they stared into the sky as if trying to see beyond it. Beyond the pain, beyond the punishment, to something else perhaps. Forgiveness, perhaps justice. The steam grew thicker, covering everything in a white haze. The sound of bubbling filled the square, replacing the silence with something worse, something heavier. People began to step back, afraid not of Richard but of themselves, of what they had allowed, of what they had watched, of what they would now carry home that night. The burning did not stop, even after the rope snapped and his body sank below the surface. There were no more screams, but no one ever forgot how they had once sounded. The cauldron continued to bubble long after the last scream had vanished into the steam. The fire beneath was fed by men with blackened hands who dared not speak, their eyes fixed downward as if afraid to meet the gaze of the boiling dead. The water was no longer clear. It was thick, dark red and brown, and full of floating pieces that had once been parts of a man. The crowd stood still, no longer with curiosity, but with a deep, unsettled silence, as though the horror had reached out from the pot and wrapped itself around their throats. They had come expecting punishment. They had come expecting justice. But what they had seen was something else, something older, something primal, a destruction so complete it made them question whether the crime even mattered anymore. Richard Roos had been a cook, perhaps a poisoner, perhaps a scapegoat. But now he was something less than a man, and something more than a warning. The king who had ordered the boiling did not attend the execution, but his law had echoed through every inch of the town. His voice was present in the fire, in the ropes, in the hands that lowered Richard into his end. And though the king had claimed that such a sentence would only be used for poisoners, the people began to wonder how long it would be before the pot was used again, not just for murderers, but for those who simply displeased power. The pulleys were pulled, the ropes retrieved wet and stained. The cauldron was covered with a large wooden lid to hold in the heat and smell, but nothing could hold in the memory. The executioner walked away without looking back, his face pale, his steps uneven. He would not return to that square again, nor would many of those who had watched. Some packed their belongings and left the town that very week, haunted not by ghosts, but by their own silence, their own stillness, their own presence at something so cruel that even history would find it difficult to write in full. The boiling of Richard Roos was not spoken of openly, but it passed through whispers, through letters, through the looks exchanged by those who had been there. They told the story without words, through wide eyes and long silences, and the story always came with questions. Was he really guilty? Did he really poison the broth? Or had he simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Had someone wanted him gone and found the perfect crime to place upon his name? And if so, then what had the people done? Had they watched an innocent man melt away? And if they had, what did that make them? The law itself was soon hidden away, not removed, not erased, but no longer spoken of. It had served its purpose. It had drawn blood and boiled it, and now it waited for the next name to rise from the lips of those in power. The cauldron was eventually removed from the square, its black iron surface dragged away like a curse being buried. The ashes of the fire were scattered, the stone beneath scrubbed until raw, but the memory refused to fade. The people remembered the screams, the smell, the steam. They remembered the way silence had wrapped around them and how no one had spoken for hours after it ended. The law that had been created for Richard Roos was never used again. Not because the crime was rare, but because the punishment had opened something dark, something unspoken. It had shown them not the strength of a king, but the fear of a man who needed blood to feel safe. The story was passed from mouth to mouth over the years, each telling softer but never empty. Children heard it and stared wide-eyed at the fire in their homes, afraid that it too might one day turn against them. Some said they could still hear the boiling at night, that the screams had sunk into the stone, and now rose with the mist. Others said it was only guilt echoing back from the hearts of those who had watched and said nothing. Justice had come. They were told, but in their dreams, they saw something else. Not a guilty man punished, but a soul burned away for power, for fear, for silence. The boiling of Richard Roos became more than an execution. It became a mark on the town, on the crown, on the hearts of everyone who had stood and done nothing, because sometimes the worst crimes are not those done by one man, but those allowed by many.